Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to radically reframe how you look at logistics and supply chain management. Seriously, if you think supply chain issues are just about tracking down better vendors or, haggling for lower rates, well, prepare to have that assumption entirely dismantled. We're zooming in on the hidden, systemic flaws that are actively holding back your growth and looking at how to fundamentally redesign your operational network for true sustainable scale.
Okay, so let's dive right into this. I've got a question that sounds completely counterintuitive. Why on earth would a strong, friendly relationship with a supplier actually be a bad thing? Well, that brings us to the core contradiction of this whole analysis. Prioritizing friendly vendor relations, it often completely masks profound structural fragility. When your operations run on a series of fortunate handshakes, your leadership team lacks the actual visibility needed to spot concentration risks before they trigger a massive, system-wide failure. Now, conventional business advice will tell you that when logistics costs spike, you need to immediately negotiate harder with your carriers or just demand faster turnaround times from your suppliers. But structurally, that is absolutely the worst possible starting point. Treating the visible invoice by just pressuring vendors actively hides the underlying network dysfunction. The real culprit behind cost escalation isn't uncompetitive rates, it's fragmented optimization, and that systematically drives up your total network costs. Just think about it like this. Supply chain disruption is a symptom. It is not a diagnosis. Things like unexplained margin compression, sudden capacity ceilings, or that recurring operational firefighting, those are all symptoms of a decision architecture failure. This happens because a company is running on unstress-tested assumptions rather than deliberate system design. If you just treat the disruption as the core problem, you're only applying a local fixes to systemic failures, and all that does is guarantee the problem is going to pop up somewhere else in your network. So what's actually causing this? It's a mechanism we call the fragmentation bottleneck. It happens when procurement optimizes exclusively for freight spend, operations optimizes exclusively for warehouse labor, and finance optimizes exclusively for inventory holding costs. What happens? The total cost of moving goods just drifts upward, completely unexamined. Since no single executive owns the holistic, big-picture system view, every local optimization inadvertently creates a brand new constraint somewhere else in the chain. It's like a giant, very expensive game of whack-a-mole. And there are very tangible, observable symptoms of this fragmentation. For instance, if your freight invoices are climbing way faster than your actual shipment volume, or if expedited shipping has somehow morphed from an emergency measure into your standard operating procedure, your network is fracturing. Now, pause and really think about this next point. Scale and growth do not break your logistics. They simply reveal the logistics architecture that was never actually designed in the first place. So, how do we actually fix this? The key is establishing concrete conditional decision rules. Here's a big one. If you observe that local, tactical fixes are failing to stop those climbing invoices, your required decision rule is to initiate a baseline network diagnostic before you even think about renegotiating carrier contracts. Because structurally, you literally cannot negotiate away an architectural flaw. A verified baseline diagnostic maps exactly where costs accumulate, making sure you aren't just squeezing a carrier for a rate reduction that's inevitably going to leak right back in through hidden accessorial charges. This brings us to a really sneaky failure mode we call relationship inertia. This is what happens when purchasing decisions are made simply because a particular vendor answers the phone quickly, or maybe they're just fun to grab coffee with. I mean, you wouldn't marry someone just because they text back fast, right? Yet companies build massive concentration risk based on this exact kind of historical comfort. You aren't building a resilient supply chain. You're building a highly precarious dependency on a single point of failure. And here is the harsh reality of that situation. If the sudden loss of a single, highly responsive vendor would completely halt your downstream production, you don't actually possess a supply chain. You possess a purchase order. Lacking an alternative sourcing strategy is fundamentally a visibility problem. It's not a vendor reliability problem. You're operating entirely exposed to external variables that you have absolutely zero control over, which leads us directly into our second concrete decision rule. If the observable condition is that losing a single vendor halts production, the required decision rule is to immediately formalize a dual sourcing strategy. Now, your operations team, they are absolutely going to resist this. They'll argue that the current vendor is super reliable, but the underlying logic of mitigating single source dependencies is just undeniable. You're purchasing systemic resilience here, not just parts. Furthermore, those ultra-comfortable relationships breed what we call asymmetric risk alignment. This is the invisible danger hiding behind informal, hey, we've always done it this way handshakes. In these undocumented arrangements, the buyer is operating on the false assumption of guaranteed availability, while the supplier is operating on the assumption that the buyer has a really high tolerance for delays. This misalignment creates massive, completely invisible operational liabilities for the buyer. Honestly, those handshake deals are essentially a ticking time bomb. Just look at the structural mismatch here. The very second market capacity tightens or some upstream disruption hits, these informal relationships are the absolute first things to collapse. And they fail because this structural misalignment means the vendor is always going to prioritize formalized contractual obligations with other clients over your informal expectations. To cure this, you've got to aggressively shift operational risk from informal assumptions into binding contractual realities. And you do this by taking action. Document explicit lead times, secure rigid capacity commitments, establish firm quality standards, and implement written escalation protocols. By doing this, you are formally stripping away the ambiguity that allows asymmetric risk to thrive. You're ensuring your network runs on enforceable logic, rather than just presumed goodwill.
All right, let's pivot slightly to inventory positioning, because this really builds on what we're talking about. There's a non-obvious distinction here that's absolutely crucial. Inventory should only exist to protect throughput at your specific operational constraint. Any stock beyond that precise requirement, that's not safety. That is frozen cash. There's a massive structural difference between holding stock that precisely matches your actual demand variability and holding stock that merely reflects organizational guesswork and, frankly, anxiety.
So why do we end up with all this anxiety-driven inventory? Well, it stems from demand forecasting failures caused by something called extrapolation with optimism. Taking historical numbers and just blindly tacking on a growth expectation creates a systemic bias. This causal mechanism essentially guarantees a widening gap between what you expect to sell and what actually ships out the door. The cure? You have to replace that optimism with a systemic feedback loop, one that's constantly calibrating forecast accuracy against actual, real-time consumption data.
In forecasting leads right into distribution network design. You really need to ask yourself this. Are your facilities positioned based on deliberate spatial logic, or are they just sitting there because of historical accident? As a business expands, trying to fulfill new customer geographies from legacy facility locations fundamentally breaks your logistics model. It introduces immense friction and cost that a deliberate, mathematically modeled network design would literally eliminate entirely.
Which brings us to a massively impactful conditional rule about calendar discipline. If your business growth relies on legacy facility locations to serve new geographic demands, you must mathematically redesign your facility positioning before signing any lease renewals. Actually, let me emphasize that. Timing a network study ahead of a forced real estate commitment is a structural savings lever that costs absolutely nothing to pull, yet it yields incredible network efficiency.
Ultimately, diagnosing all of this leads us to one inescapable truth. Execution without systems is just expensive repetition. A true supply chain diagnostic doesn't end with some outside consultant handing over a static report. The real value is in the transfer of measurement discipline. The goal is to build internal capabilities and systems so your own operations team can sustain the improvements, rather than perpetually paying to fix the exact same systemic errors over and over again. So, to summarize this structural teardown, let's recap the 5 operational pillars we've covered. You absolutely have to actively map your dependencies, analyze your inventory logic, formalize your vendor risks, examine your spatial architecture, and correct your forecasting biases. Taking informal habits across these pillars and converting them into formal decision architectures is exactly how you permanently eliminate the invisible bottlenecks that are restricting your operational scale. I want to leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought. When you look deeply at your supply chain today, are you looking at a network engineered for structural resilience, or is it a fragile house of cards held together by lucky handshakes? I really hope this explainer has sparked a desire to diagnose the invisible forces acting on your network. Thanks for tuning in, and definitely start redesigning that architecture today.